There's a lot of different language that is used to describe what individuals like myself do. Yeah, you'll hear terms like death doula, death midwife, end of life consultant, end of life doula. But honestly, they're all essentially variants of the same thing. It's an individual who comes in and really wants to advocate for the best interests of the patient or the client or the client's loved ones, and essentially make sure that they are aware of their full spectrum of rights without being someone who necessarily stands to profit by a really large margin depending on which direction they go. You know, a lot of us have our own preferences when it comes to certain things, as we do, but we're not bringing those preferences to the table when we're working with a family or we're working with an individual. We're literally just wanting to give back what is rightfully already theirs, that systems that are in place, and prevent them from accessing and having the ability to be aware and to have knowledge of what they can and cannot choose. So that's a piece of it. We fill the gap between, say, like the medical profession and hospice very nicely. So a lot of times there will be some overlap in maybe some of the work that we do and how it dovetails with hospice. And a lot of us have experience in hospice or come from either a hospice volunteer background or a hospice nurse background or things of that nature. So we also come in a wide variety of flavors. There's nothing I can think of where you couldn't implement advocating for someone's rights and death work in some way, shape, or form. I mean, I know a woman who is a nutritionalist, and she wants to try to find a way to take her work and specify it for the grieving, for the dying. I know a lot of massage therapists who have decided they want to use their skills to specifically work with that demographic as well. So some of us have a focus on green burial and advocating for conservational burial and establishing new burial grounds, things of that nature. Some of us are focused on the actual act of supporting families in caring for their own loved ones after death in their own home environments. Oftentimes this is referred to as a home funeral or a wake. So that's one thing. We can also be very proactive about end-of-life planning. So like power of attorney medical forms, DNRs, things of that nature. And just talking about the funeral industry openly and talking about the different statutes and laws that may be in place in each state that restrict families from being able to do certain things. So it's a huge, I mean, and that's just still kind of scratching the surface of the breadth of the work and what we can do and how we kind of fit into the picture. I refer to myself as a community death care advocate or a death midwife, but I'm one of the only individuals actively serving in the state of Indiana doing this. There's a handful of us, but there's really not very many, and that is changing. So I've started mentorships recently. It's a 6-month program, one-on-one, a deep dive into death phobia, personal experiences with grief, all sorts of stuff. And so there's a lot of interest in that. And there's a lot of people who want to understand and get connected to this movement and this work, which is really exciting. And we need more. We need more people who are willing to dive in and who are willing to be a part of this. So I right now kind of have my hand in a number of different things, and hopefully that I'll be able to do a little less of that as there's more of us involved who have specific passions and interests in certain areas. So I advocate for green burial and trying to get a new conservational burial ground here in Indiana. There's conversations beginning to happen even this year with a large not-for-profit that is dedicated to land conservation in this area, in this region, and wants to look into doing that for their membership and for any member of the community who wants that as an option post-death. So I'll do that. I do a lot of educational talks and presentations. That's a huge part of the work. And I also do support families and individuals as they're navigating really hard spaces that revolve around end of life, or are looking ahead, even if there's not a diagnosis on the table at the moment. There's an awareness of, hey, we want to be more open about this. We want to create a family culture where we can talk about these things. And so I can come in and I can help facilitate that. I don't know if any other death midwives or death doulas have brought this up, but I'm sort of distancing myself a little bit from the death positivity language, because in some regards, I understand the intentions behind it and the movement. The idea was that we are bringing death to the forefront of our own awareness and conversation. But death positivity has a very specific tone. And the reality is that for a lot of our clients, they're dealing with traumatic deaths or violent deaths or sudden deaths, and for them the catchphrase, the popular hashtag death positivity, can be very grating, because there's nothing positive about it for them. They're going through this experience and it's awful in every way, shape, and form. So I support what the purpose of it is, but I'm not a huge fan or proponent of the language, because I think it can be insensitive at times to actual individuals actually wrestling with death. So I think as far as death avoidance and death phobia are concerned, I think we absolutely, our culture is highly addicted to productivity. We're highly addicted to personal growth and development. We're highly addicted to individuality. All of these things, when you combine them, sort of create a perfect storm where it's like death has no place. Where does death fit in to this equation, essentially? Because death, when you really face it and accept it, and I'm talking about like the physical aspects of it, not necessarily like the metaphysical or the spiritual, and there's a whole spectrum of beliefs on that as well. But when you're looking at just the physical, it's an end. It is an absolute end. It's, there isn't personal growth involved necessarily. And it grates against a lot of our ideals and the things that we value the most. So, for example, I think that when we look at the standard burial practices of today, they're excessively death phobic and death avoidant. There's an entire process in place that is not legally required, embalming, but that people utilize all the time and are falsely led into believing, or allowed to believe, that they need, and that is legally required. When I started this work, I asked my grandmother, who, she's a Spitfire, she's in her early 90s now, still lives on her own. And I said, hey, could I go sit down with a number of funeral homes and use like the pre-planning you want to do as a reason to just sit across from them and ask a whole bunch of questions and see what happens? And she gave me the green light. So I went and did that. And I can't tell you the number of times a sales rep or an individual from typically one of the larger corporately owned funeral homes. I didn't encounter this as much, to be completely honest, at the locally owned smaller funeral homes, but the larger corporately owned funeral homes, I had a number of times where someone would be sitting across from me and I would say, hey, okay, I don't think my grandmother wants to be embalmed, so what are our options there? And they would look me in the eye and tell me she had to be. And that one person actually told me, no, she's going to have to be embalmed to prevent the spread of MRSA. And I looked right back at them and I said, well, wouldn't she have to have MRSA to spread MRSA? What if she dies from cancer? What if there is no MRSA? And they kind of stammered and they didn't know how to answer. But the reality is, I don't think it's malicious. I think that there is a large percentage of individuals, even working in the funeral industry, who don't know. There's just rampant miseducation, and it's kind of allowed to perpetuate because a confused consumer is going to probably result in higher profit margins, on the other side of the table. So it's really unfortunate. And that's one thing that I know everyone that I'm aware of who does this work is very passionate about. We are very passionate about making sure others aren't taken advantage of and that they're not being misled. So that's one way that I think the death avoidance and the death phobia presents itself, is the way that things unfold in a standard, funeral process. We don't involve ourselves with the body very much. We're not very hands-on. Typically, if someone dies on hospice, the hospice nurse comes in and he or she is the one to wash the body, possibly, take care of any clothing, if they might want to change their clothing, if they were wearing something or not. So, these are things we've kind of passed everything off. The things we used to do for our loved ones, we now let others do for us. And then all that's left to do is sign paperwork and go sit down and make financial decisions and, decide what we want for the service and ceremony, and that stuff, it's not somatic. It's not involving the body. And I really think that grief is an embodied experience. Mourning is an embodied experience. It should be. And when we divorce those things, when we take away someone's ability to engage with this process on a physical level, we're harming them. I heard a speaker once say something beautiful. She said, we have to be able to carry the heavy in our hands, not just our hearts. We need to. And I think that I see that missing. We don't dig our own graves for our loved ones anymore, or pick up the shovels and bury them and like have that tangible experience and that memory in our bodies. I think another way is just we don't talk about it. And, most adolescents, most young adults, or maybe even adults, depending what age you're looking at, if you asked them about their experiences with death today, I would say the average person, a younger person, wouldn't say that they had very many up close, hands-on experiences with death or with being with someone following a death. Most of their knowledge or awareness or experiences are probably manufactured and come from media or come from, video games or literature. And so to my knowledge, there's no studies out there on this, but I can't imagine that it's very healthy for the population at large, or for anyone, when you take something as tremendous and universally human as death, and then you shut it behind closed doors and you say, we're not going to talk about this, and we're not going to let you have access to it. And the only time you're going to get to interact with it is in an extremely sanitized, ABCD, okay, you're done sort of way. That's not the nature of death. That's not what we're invited into, I think, when we are experiencing the death of someone close to us. And, even just not knowing really how much to involve our children. Like, do we shelter our children from death and not tell them the full truth? Or do we bring them to the funerals? Or do we, children follow our lead. So when we are uncertain and when we are afraid, they're going to learn that, absorb it, even just the energy, and they're going to mimic it. And one of the most beautiful, whatever the opposite of death avoidance would be, I guess, death embracing. Maybe that's a good term. Maybe that's a little different than death positivity. But one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen is a family a couple years ago who had a father die of a cancer diagnosis at home on hospice. And the couple was very intentional about wanting their children to be involved in the process. So they had planned ahead for him to stay at home at least for a full day, if not longer. And those children, when they woke up, they didn't have the experience some do, where dad's really, really sick, or, their family member's really sick, and then they wake up and then they're gone. And they've just literally poof, vanished, which psychologically, I can't imagine what that would be like for a child. They had this time to organically process and engage with what had happened. And I think observing them do that, and then talking with their mother in the weeks and months that followed, she said that they really seem to be processing their grief in a healthy way. It doesn't matter if the child is the one who is still living and is grieving, or if the child is the one who has the terminal diagnosis and is dying. Children have some different needs than adults do because of where they're at in life and developmentally, and because of their dependence, right, on the adults around them and the community that holds them and supports them. So For example, one of the things I know that can be really tricky and difficult when the child is the one that has the diagnosis is how much to tell them, how much to prepare them for what could happen versus scaring them. That is an overwhelming dance for any parent to have to think about, so it makes sense that a lot of parents, I think, in that situation err on the side of not talking about death. And a lot of them probably haven't had the exposure or the awareness or the ability to reckon with their own death avoidance. And so if you've got some innate death avoidance already, and then your own child is potentially dying or is dying, that is just, it's gonna be too much. It's gonna be overwhelming. And so I have a lot of compassion and a lot of empathy for the ways that different people respond, because I understand that we're all coming to these places from very specific backgrounds, and for a lot of us from a lack of education and involvement and awareness. Great starting point would be literally just including death as a part of the life cycle. And that could be done from a scientific standpoint, probably in curriculum and schools and like biology and science. But honestly, I think it would be fascinating to go into the schools and to facilitate and have conversations with kids about death, because they're fearless a lot of times in a way that adults are not. And they'll ask the questions or tell the stories that an adult might want to, and then go, oh, I don't know if that's appropriate. I don't know. I'm uncomfortable now. How is that going to make other people feel? Sometimes kids will just say it. I think that's why Caitlin Doughty wrote her book. One of her recent ones was like, will my cat eat my eyeballs? And it was all questions from kids that she thinks are fantastic, because they're willing to ask those things that probably many of us have also wondered. And so I think that's one way. I think giving permission, in a sense, by embodying these things, which is what all of us are trying to do, by being invitational. So for example, in just everyday and day interactions, here's a perfect story I can tell you. I was traveling to New Mexico last year, and I was on the plane and was seated next to an older gentleman. And as you do sometimes, we just started a little bit of chit chat. And he at one point revealed that his daughter had drowned many, many, many years ago. And at this point, I had not said anything about my work. I often won't unless it comes up organically somehow. And so I just listened. And he said at the end of this short story about his daughter drowning, he said, I can't believe I survived that. And there was this little nudge inside me, like, oh, here's an opportunity. Here's a moment. And so my response to him was, I wouldn't be surprised if a large part of you didn't survive that. And he thought for a minute. He was very quiet. And then he said, you're right. You're absolutely right. A big part of me didn't survive that. And then we just let it be. There was no other commentary. And it was a really beautiful moment where I was able to validate the grief of a complete stranger. And I think we need to be more attuned to moments like that. We need to be open, and we need to be aware that people need to have experiences like that, and they need to have their grief and their mourning validated, because that's another huge piece, is that when you talk about disenfranchised grief, that's a whole nother ballgame. But grief itself already is something that so many of us are expected to sweep under the rug, or it just goes unseen. We just, the system, the mechanisms of how we grieve as a nation culturally are completely broken. They have just broken down. We have lost our connection to ritual, to meaningful ritual. We have rituals, but whether or not they're meaningful and they nourish our souls and they help us through these times is something else. And we don't know how to walk with someone through long suffering. We don't know how to do that. That is a completely lost skill. And so one of the things I'm trying to do to address some of this is I will be hosting on Zoom my first like class. Essentially, it's not really a class, it's a conversation. So it's an open invitation to a conversation called Grief Kind: How to Not Hurt the Hurting. And we're going to dive into a bunch of these elements and talk about what a healthier model of grieving communally and supporting someone in grief could look like. And some of it is as simple as remembering to put the day that someone died on your calendar. You know, like if I have my really, really good friend Brian, whose mother died and he was a single child his whole life, you know, I'm going to put that day in my calendar so that when it comes around, I remember and I can send him a message, or I can send him a card, or I can reach out, or I can just say, hey, do you want to go out for lunch today? Do you know, do you think it's going to be hard? Or checking in later in the day and going, how are you feeling? I'm thinking about you. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't have to be big, but there are some very real, tangible things we could do to be with those who are in grief and to make their grief less invisible, because that's the most awful thing in the world, is to be grieving. And then on top of just your grief, to feel like you have to fight for it to even be acknowledged. And I wish, if I could change anything, I mean, if I could snap my fingers right now and like change anything about the entire culture, it would probably be that. It would be to somehow miraculously give us a much more understanding, open, compassionate culture when it comes to grief and mourning. The reality is that if you are going to really engage with your grief, not just grief, if you're going to engage with your grief, you have to listen to it. You have to listen to yourself. There is no other option. And I think that really scares people. I think that you're touching on other issues we have that overlap into some of these areas. Like, I think we've got major body issues as a culture. I mean, that's been in a lot of conversations and narratives lately. And so if we're alienated from our own bodies and we don't know our bodies as good the way they are right now, like living and breathing and digesting food and moving, like how on earth are we ever going to be able to relate to a dead body as good? That's like a million miles away. So that we have this huge path we have to walk to get there. And yeah, there's so much about grief. The way I think about it is this, or a metaphor that I'll use sometimes when I'm talking is this. Grief asks us to sit at its feet, you know, when it comes into our lives. And we do not take charge of grief. We do not. And it's tempting to do that, right? Because that's how we run our lives. That's how we manage everything else. But if you're really going to step into grief, which a lot of us choose not to do, that's a choice. It's one of the differences between grief and mourning. There's a lot of language, lack of clarity, but grief is like, well, bereavement is what happens in the moment the awareness of death comes upon someone. You are bereaved in that moment. It's like a biological, psychological response. And then grief is what happens in you following that moment. So bereavement and grief can overlap, but eventually bereavement kind of trickles off and turns into grief. And then mourning, which is a word you don't hear used enough anymore, mourning is the choice to engage with that grief and to let it change you and to let it exist and breathe and to acknowledge it and be real in an embodied way.